Shiv, welcome back. In this installment we'll focus on painting our figure's black leather jacket. To me, one of the key things to painting black is just having the confidence to leave most of the surface black. If you overwork it, you're going to end up with a grey effect. The second thing is to keep your highlights small and punchy. Again, if you make them too big or with too long of a gradient, you'll end up painting grey. Start by basing the jacket in black. I used Vallejo model colour black, but you can use whatever you have or whatever you like. The more satin or glossy your black is, the darker it's going to look. To create our initial highlight, we're going to take some of this scale colour Caribbean blue and add it into the black to turn it grey. If you're trying this out with a different colour scheme, just mix in any saturated colour you've already used elsewhere on your model. Mixing your own grey rather than relying on a pre-mixed paint should give you a more harmonious final result. Paint this onto the areas where the jacket will be catching the light. So one of the neat things about black is that the initial base coat will naturally reflect a lot of the light, so you'll actually be able to see where you want your highlights just by holding the miniature under a light source. So here up at the shoulder we'll put in a small highlight. The upper part of the back is sloping away from the light, so we just leave that alone. However, here at the bottom, it starts to tilt up facing the light. So we'll place some highlights in the middle of those raised details, leaving the creases between them in shadow. We'll need a highlight on the collar here too, adding essentially an edge highlight on that lower part. Grazing the side of the brush along the edge in order to get a clean line. Like with most of the model, we're using quite thin paint, so we'll apply these highlights over a couple of layers to ensure we get decent coverage. To help blend out the edge of the paint, you can thin your colour to a glaze consistency with a little water. Then with a very small amount on the brush, use the glaze to help smooth out the highlights. Lightly drawing the brush up and over the edges of the highlights, applying a very thin layer of the glaze to the surface. On the shoulder, as we have more surface to play with, we'll add a few little dots to help fade out the highlight while creating some subtle textures. Just be careful that you don't draw the edge out so far that you end up covering up the whole back. Remember, you want to retain a lot of that black so that you don't end up painting grey. If you do mess this up, you can make a glaze with black and just glaze down over the edge of the highlight a few times to help reduce the grey. Alright, so we're going to switch back to our thicker consistency and continue applying the highlights to the rest of the jacket. So here on the sleeve we're picking out the tops of all the little creases, leaving that underside of the arm black. It's worth bearing in mind while you're placing these that your initial highlights will end up looking a lot darker after you put in your much brighter highlights. Here on the other side of the jacket, we'll pick out those creases near the bottom. They will be catching quite a lot of light. Then we're going to do the other sleeve in the same way, just picking out the areas that would be catching the light. So the top of the shoulder and then the top of all the little creases along the upper side of the arm. And I'll do the chest as well, adding a rimmed highlight on top there. Finally adding a highlight onto the lapel, pulling the paint up over the surface to the upper edges. Then we can take our glaze again and smooth out any highlights that are a bit rough. Drawing the glaze up and over the trailing edge to help even out the transitions. And you're going to apply that over a few layers, letting each one dry before adding a new one. And we'll do these on the chest as well, just to soften out that hard edge around the outside. Once you're happy with that, you can add a little scale colour white sands into your mix to lighten it, making it more of a medium grey tone, similar in brightness to Games Workshop Dawnstone. We'll use that to apply another layer of highlights, again targeting the spots that would be catching the most light, so on top of any little creases. This time making our highlights quite small in order to make sure that we don't end up with that dreaded grey effect. Here on the side, we'll try to build up the highlight in the middle of those creases so they fall on the raised part of the hip. And we'll apply them with little horizontal lines to create a subtle texture on the surface, pulling the paint up over the surface to the upper edges. Same idea here on the sleeve, using small lines to build up a more interesting texture on the large highlights. Then just picking out the edges on the smaller parts. On the back, we'll try to pull the highlights towards the middle on the lower part. The reason for that is that the middle of the back is the highest point on the surface, so you'd expect it to catch more light as it's going to be closer to it. Think about drawing or pulling the paint into position rather than just placing it there. Remember, acrylics are transparent when thinned, and more paint will be left at the end of your brush stroke. Thus, by drawing the paint over the surface and stopping where you actually want to highlight, you can create a gradient into it, ideally building it up over a few layers. Again, on the larger areas, we can paint the highlight on with little lines in order to create some texture on the surface. And on the collar, we'll draw the paint into the middle of that edge highlight, targeting the centre so that the highlight makes sense with the one on the lower back. When I'm working on these small edge highlights, I like to first place a dot of paint as a guide and then sweep the bristles up to that point from either side. I find it helps me get the paint where I want it, while ensuring the brightest part will end up with a bit more paint, making the highlight more intense. Alright, so really it's just a case of working your way around the jacket and picking out all the little details. You should start to see what I meant by the initial highlight becoming darker as we begin to add brighter layers on top. Overall, the jacket is going to look a lot darker the brighter our highlights get. I know that sounds like a bit of a paradox, but it's just because when you place something bright next to something dark, the dark area will appear darker in comparison, and vice versa for the brighter areas. Alright, so we'll apply a couple small circles onto the chest. Just like I've mentioned before, you want to try and match the shape of your highlight to the shape of the surface that you're painting. So because the chest is round, we make our highlights round as well. To continue, we're going to take some of that grey colour and thin it down to a glaze consistency with a bit of water. Then we'll use that to soften out any of the highlights that need it. So these ones on the chest, for example. Just by applying a few layers of the glaze along the edge of the highlight, we're able to create a blurring effect so that the edge isn't so obvious. And you can do that for any highlights that seem to have an abrupt endpoint. Always pulling the bristles up and over the edges, applying them over a few layers, letting each one dry before adding a new one. And you repeat that until you're happy with the result. To continue, we'll add some more of the white sands into the grey, making a significant jump in brightness this time. Remember that we want to create quite punchy highlights, avoiding that slow progression from dark to light. And this is going to ensure that we retain a black look to the jacket. Now we'll essentially do the same thing again, but we'll try to make our highlights about half the size as the previous layer, focusing on the upper part of all the little folds and creases. You can see I'm still using quite a thin consistency, and that's so that I have more control over the transparency. By keeping the paint thin, I can create a bit of a transition by applying a series of transparent layers, making each one a little smaller than the previous one. Same thing on the back, again trying to build up the intensity of the highlights towards that middle point. Think about drawing or pulling the paint into position rather than just placing it there. ideally building it up over a few layers. And again on the collar you can see that I'm using that dot and sweep technique from earlier, targeting that midpoint so that it matches the highlights towards the lower part of the jacket. On the bottom we'll start to include some edge highlights, just drawing the side of the brush along that edge, allowing it to lightly graze the surface so that we leave a nice thin line. On the shoulder here you can see the way that I'm lightly drawing the paint up over the edge, over a few passes in order to create a small transition, making it much brighter at the very top of the shoulder. And the same idea on the other side of the jacket. Apply the paint over a few layers, gradually making it more intense around that midpoint. Think about drawing or pulling the paint into position rather than just placing it there. Again, trying to build up the intensity of the highlights towards that middle point. Ideally building it up over a few layers. I think I went a little off on that lower one, but I can correct that with some of the darker highlight. And then just paint that lighter colour back in over the top. Again, we're not trying to be perfect, but we also don't want to leave in obvious mistakes that would be easy to fix. So we'll continue that on the sleeve, building up those sharp, bright highlights just along the top part of the creases. Adding in some texturing where the surface allows us to do so. By keeping the paint thin, I can create a bit of a transition by applying a series of transparent layers, making each one a little smaller than the previous one. Again, targeting the spots that would be catching the most light, so on top of any little creases. This time making our highlights quite small in order to make sure that we don't end up with that dreaded grey effect. So these lines on the shoulder just give us a little something extra to look at, so that the highlight isn't quite so sterile. Then we'll add a couple very small highlights in the middle of the chest, just painting on small dots in that centre point. I think they're a bit offset, which looks a bit weird, so I'll paint over one with our darker highlight, and then I'll repaint it with the lighter colour so that they line up. Yeah, so the placement of that looks a lot better now. To finish things off, we're going to take some of the white sands on its own, and we'll go back and apply very tiny highlights in the more prominent spots. Here in the middle of the shoulder highlight, I'm just adding a tiny little dot. You can see it finishes it off really well. When you're doing these, just try to barely touch the surface, be very gentle with how you hold the brush and slowly lower it onto the surface so that the tip very lightly touches it. It's tricky to do, but practice definitely makes it easier. Alright, so then we'll add a dot into the middle of some of the creases. You don't have to hit every single one, just pick out some of the ones you like the look of. So yep, I quite like how that's looking. You could add some sort of freehand on the back of our jacket if you wanted to get fancy, but I quite like this plain black effect, so I'm happy to leave it alone. In the next video of this series, we're going to take a look at how to paint her miniskirt, and we'll be doing that with a pink tartan design. Alright troops, so that's about all from me. Thank you as always for your generous support, and I hope to see you in the next installment. Thanks again. Bye for now.